In a world full of challenges, how would a voice crying out in the desert stand out? Imagine a man, solitary, facing kings and stormy winds, determined to change the course of history. This is the story of Elijah, a prophet who was not intimidated by oppression and idolatry. Have you ever stopped to think about the weight of being called by God in times of uncertainty? Elijah, with his burning heart, not only prayed but interacted with the very heavens. In the midst of an unrelenting drought, he confronted the powerful and challenged the beliefs that dominated his people. But who was this man behind the bravery? What went through his mind when darkness seemed to swallow his hope? Throughout his journey, moments of glory and despair intertwine, revealing a vulnerable yet strong human being. In his story, you will find not only miracles but the essence of faith that persists even in the darkest hours. Get ready to dive into the life of a prophet who, guided by God, became a legend. What would you do if you were in his place? Elijah's calling. Elijah, a simple man from the land of Gilead, received a divine calling that would change not only his life but the entire history of Israel. Imagine the scene, a typical day when he was likely taking care of his chores when, suddenly, the voice of God echoed in his heart. This calling was not merely an invitation to serve, but a clear and urgent mission, to confront the idolatry that plagued the people of Israel. It was a moment of courage, a summons to rise against the corrupt practices that spread like a shadow over the nation. The significance of his mission was not just for him, but for all the people of Israel. Elijah had the task of restoring true worship to God at a time when idolatry had become the norm. This mission required not only faith but also a boldness that few could imagine. Realizing the responsibility that rested on his shoulders, Elijah had to reflect on what it truly meant to be a prophet in such a hostile context. The weight of the calling was not light, but he was determined to move forward, even in the face of the challenges that awaited him. Elijah's response to the calling was a demonstration of unwavering faith. He did not hesitate to accept his mission, even knowing that it would put him in direct conflict with powerful figures like King Ahab and Queen Jezebel. This willingness to act in obedience to God resonates even today, inspiring many to seek divine will in their own lives, even if it means facing difficulties. Elijah was not just a prophet, he became a symbol of resistance and faith in times of crisis. Elijah's calling also prompts us to reflect on how each of us may be summoned in times of need. Sometimes, the calling may not be as dramatic, but it is still important. Elijah's story reminds us that each of us has a role to play in the fight against injustice and corruption, and that, like Elijah, we must be ready to listen and act. What he did was a powerful example of how a single individual can make a difference in a world that seems to be straying from the right path. Thus, Elijah's calling is an invitation for all of us. It is a reminder that God still speaks and that each of us is capable of responding to that call, whatever mission is entrusted to us. Elijah's legacy begins here, in his willingness to hear and obey the voice of God, an example that continues to inspire faith in many to this day. Historical context. To understand Elijah's mission, it is essential to delve into the historical context of Israel during his ministry. The nation was going through a tumultuous period under the reign of Ahab, who, influenced by his wife Jezebel, led the people to adopt idolatrous practices on a large scale. The worship of Baal, a Canaanite deity, spread, and the worship of the God of Israel was relegated to the background. Jezebel's influence, a strong and manipulative woman, was particularly devastating, as she not only introduced idol worship but also persecuted the prophets of God. In this scenario, Ahab's leadership was marked by weaknesses and compromises. He was swayed by the pressure of Jezebel and the political interests of the time, preferring to please his wife and the powerful rather than doing what was right in God's eyes. This environment of corruption and idolatry created a spiritual vacuum, and Elijah's voice was necessary to bring a message of repentance and return to the true God. The situation in Israel was not just a religious crisis, it was a moral and social crisis, where the people were drifting away from what was just and true. Elijah's boldness in presenting himself before King Ahab was uncommon for the time. He knew he was going against the grain, challenging not only the authority of the king but also the popularity of Baal worship. This courage was a reflection of his deep conviction that God was with him. Elijah was not intimidated by the threats and oppression he might face. On the contrary, his determination to fulfill the divine mission made him a fascinating and admirable figure. The drought that struck Israel during Elijah's time served as a clear sign of God's judgment upon the nation. This was not just a matter of climate, it was a symbol of divine displeasure regarding idolatry. The drought, therefore, was not mere chance, but an act of God to draw the people's attention and lead them to reflect on their choices. The suffering brought by the drought was an opportunity for the people to reconsider their worship and turn back to the God who had freed them from Egypt. Thus, the historical context in which Elijah operated not only shaped his mission but also highlighted the urgency of his message. He became the voice of God in a time of great need, and his story resonates today as a reminder that even in times of crisis, there is always room for hope and change. The challenges he faced mirror the struggles many still encounter when standing against injustice and corruption. Confrontation with Ahab. The moment Elijah presented himself before King Ahab is a landmark in the history of the prophet. Imagine the scene: a simple man, a farmer from the field, daring to enter the presence of the king, surrounded by guards and powerful advisors. Elijah's heart must have raced, but he knew that his mission was more important than any personal fear. This boldness was not just a matter of courage, it was an affirmation of faith in God and in the mission entrusted to him. Elijah not only presented himself before Ahab but also brought a direct and challenging message: there will be neither dew nor rain in the years ahead, except at my word. This act of prophecy was a declaration of war against the idolatry that dominated the nation. In doing this, Elijah was placing himself in a position of extreme risk, as Ahab and Jezebel would not easily tolerate such a challenge. Elijah's determination to speak the truth, even in the face of danger, is a characteristic that makes him a model of faith. The confrontation between Elijah and Ahab was more than just a verbal clash, it symbolized the struggle between truth and falsehood, between the worship of the true God and the idols the people had chosen to follow. This battle was not just personal, it represented the struggle of an entire people. Elijah became the voice of God at a time when many were silent, and his courage was a powerful testimony that the truth must be proclaimed, even when it brings consequences. The risk involved in confronting Ahab was palpable. Elijah knew that his life could be in danger, and history shows us that Jezebel did not hesitate to pursue the prophets of God. However, Elijah's faith empowered him to move forward, even when the challenges became daunting. This fearless spirit is something many can learn from, as in our own lives, we also face situations where we need to stand for truth and justice, even if it puts us at risk. Thus, the confrontation with Ahab was not just an isolated episode, it was a turning point in the spiritual struggle of Israel. Elijah's courage in presenting himself before the king and challenging idolatry is an example of how a single individual can rise against evil and make a difference. This lesson remains relevant, reminding us that even in the face of great adversity, the truth must always be proclaimed. The drought in Israel. The drought that struck Israel during Elijah's ministry is one of the most significant elements of his story. It was not merely a natural phenomenon, but a divine judgment upon a nation that had turned away from the true God. The absence of rain and dew was a powerful symbol showing God's displeasure with the idolatry that dominated the people. This drought not only affected agriculture but also had profound social and spiritual implications. For the Israelites, rain was a sign of God's blessing, and its absence meant the lack of that blessing. This led to a period of intense suffering and despair. The lands became barren, the harvests failed, and the people faced hunger. The drought served as a warning, an opportunity for the people to reflect on their choices and turn their hearts back to God. It was a moment of crisis that required a response, and this became increasingly evident as the situation worsened. Elijah, as a prophet of God, had the role of announcing that this drought was a sign of divine judgment. He did not hesitate to communicate this message, even knowing that it could make him a target of anger and contempt. For him, it was essential that the people understood the reason they were facing such calamity. The drought was not merely a matter of lack of water but an opportunity for repentance and a return to the God who had always cared for them. God's response. When Elijah cried out to the Lord on Mount Carmel, he was not merely expressing a plea, he was challenging an entire system of beliefs that had taken root in Israel. Elijah's fervent prayer was not a solitary act but a cry of hope amid apostasy. And, in response, God did not hesitate. Fire descended from heaven, consuming Elijah's offering, the wood, the stones, and even the water he had poured over the altar. This event was not merely a powerful spectacle, it was a clear declaration of God's sovereignty over Baal and all other false deities. The impact of this miracle was immediate and overwhelming. The people of Israel, who were divided between worshipping the Lord and Baal, fell prostrate before the true God. "The Lord is God," they shouted in unison, finally acknowledging the error of their ways. This moment not only restored the faith of the people but also solidified Elijah's position as a prophet of God. The transformation that occurred there was palpable, and Elijah's courage in the face of opposition became an example of faith and boldness. However, this victory did not mean that the path would be easy from then on. God's response, while triumphant, did not eliminate the challenges that Elijah would face. He knew that the wrath of Jezebel, the idolatrous queen, would be undeniable after the humiliation of the prophets of Baal. The courage demonstrated on Mount Carmel would quickly become a target, and the pressure on Elijah would increase. This leads us to understand that even in spiritual victories, the battle continues. The fire that descended from heaven was not only a response to Elijah's cry, it was also a sign that God was still present in the history of the people of Israel. This divine manifestation reminded the Israelites that, even in times of crisis, God would not abandon them. The trust they placed in Elijah after this event was a reflection of their renewed faith, showing that when we are willing to make ourselves available to God, He can do extraordinary things through us. Thus, God's response to Elijah's cry not only had an immediate impact but also echoed in the generations that followed. The story of Elijah and his encounter with the divine on Mount Carmel would become a reference of faith for many, showing that sincere prayer and devotion can indeed open doors to miracles. Flight and despair. After the grand demonstration of God's power, Elijah faced a moment of despair that many might find surprising. Pursued by the fury of Jezebel, who swore to kill him, the prophet found himself in a state of vulnerability and fear. The same courage that propelled him to confront the prophets of Baal now seemed to have vanished. Elijah fled to the desert, abandoning the security he had experienced after the miracle. His journey was not just physical, it was an internal struggle, marked by an intense desire to escape pain and pressure. In the desert, Elijah felt completely alone. He sat under a broom tree and, in a moment of deep anguish, asked God to take his life. "Enough. I am no better than my ancestors," he lamented. This statement reveals the depth of his despair. A man who had faced kings and prophets now felt defeated and worthless. It was a reminder that even the greatest spiritual leaders can face moments of weakness and doubt. This desire for death was not just an expression of physical exhaustion, it was the culmination of a series of emotional and spiritual pressures. Elijah had battled against idolatry, faced opposition, and now found himself surrounded by fear and loneliness. The life of a prophet is not made up only of triumphs, it is also filled with challenges that can lead to exhaustion. Elijah, like many of us, found himself in a dark place, questioning his own mission and worth. However, Elijah's despair did not go unnoticed by God. This part of the story reminds us that even in our lowest moments, God is present. He did not abandon Elijah but found him in his solitude and despair. Elijah's vulnerability invites us to reflect on our own struggles and how, often, we can feel alone in our battles. Elijah's flight and despair are a testament to the complexity of spiritual life. Even those who have powerful experiences with God can face crises of faith and moments of discouragement. It is a reminder that the spiritual journey is full of emotional roller coasters and that it is normal, and even expected, to have moments of doubt and fragility. Dialogue with God. After his flight and despair, Elijah had a transformative encounter with God in the desert. In his solitude, he was led to a place where he could have an intimate and honest dialogue with the Lord. This moment of conversation was not just an exchange of words, it was a space of vulnerability where Elijah could express his doubts, fears, and frustrations. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" God asked, and this question resonated in the prophet's soul, prompting him to reflect on his mission and emotional state. Elijah replied sincerely, sharing his feelings of failure and fear for his life. He felt isolated, thinking he was the only faithful remnant in Israel. This intimate conversation with God reveals a crucial aspect of the relationship between humans and the divine: honesty. Many of us, in moments of anguish, may think we need to hide our true emotions from God, but Elijah's example teaches us that God desires an authentic relationship. God's response was not a reprimand but a loving guidance. He not only listened to Elijah's complaints but also instructed him on what needed to be done next. God brought a new perspective to the prophet, showing that Elijah's work was not finished. He had a purpose to fulfill, and there were still many who had not bowed to Baal. This renewal of calling was essential for restoring Elijah's faith and determination. This intimate dialogue also highlights the importance of communication with God in our own lives. Often, we need that space to express our struggles and receive direction. Just like Elijah, we are invited to open our hearts and allow God to guide us through challenges. Elijah's willingness to dialogue with God is an example of faith that encourages us to seek the divine presence, even when we feel lost. In the end, Elijah's encounter with God in the desert transformed his despair into renewal. Instead of continuing to flee, he was sent back to his mission, this time with a new perspective and strength. This dialogue with God is a powerful reminder that, even in the darkest moments, we can find hope and direction when we turn to the Lord. God's care. While Elijah was in his moment of vulnerability, God demonstrated deep and attentive care through unexpected provisions. After his prayer of despair, God sent an angel to take care of him. The angel brought bread and water, and Elijah, even in his exhaustion, was fed and strengthened. This simple yet significant gesture reveals that God cares about the physical and emotional needs of his servants. He not only hears our prayers but also acts on our behalf, even when we are unaware of his presence. God's care for Elijah was not limited to a single moment. After being fed, the prophet was renewed in strength and walked for 40 days and 40 nights to Mount Horeb, where he would have an even deeper encounter with God. This journey was not just an escape but an opportunity for Elijah to spiritually recharge. God's care is a reminder that, even when we feel weak and alone, he is always present, ready to strengthen and guide us. God's care for Elijah manifests in practical and direct ways. He did not allow him to succumb to despair but provided what was necessary for Elijah to continue his mission. This divine interaction teaches us about God's nature as a loving Father, who does not ignore our struggles but actively engages in our lives. Often, in our moments of weakness, we may not perceive God's care, but he is always working around us, even in the small things. Furthermore, the way God cared for Elijah invites us to reflect on how we can also care for one another in times of need. Just as God sent an angel to strengthen Elijah, we are called to be instruments of care and love for those around us who are going through difficulties. God's care inspires us to act in solidarity, offering support, food, and encouragement to those in need. Transfiguration and Ascension. The moment of Elijah's transfiguration is undoubtedly one of the most striking in the biblical narrative. It occurs in a context that not only highlights the grandeur of the prophet but also reveals the unique relationship he had with God. Imagine the scene: Elijah, a man who had faced kings and false prophets, now prepares for a supernatural encounter. It is as if heaven and earth are about to collide, and the expectation is palpable. What makes this event even more fascinating is how it symbolizes the culmination of a life dedicated to the divine calling. When Elijah is taken up to heaven in a chariot of fire, the image is so vivid that it remains etched in the memory of those who read it. This is not a simple departure, it is a glorious ascension. The chariot, with its horses of fire, not only represents the majesty of God but also confirms that Elijah fulfilled his mission on earth. There is no sad farewell, but a celebration of what he accomplished. This transfiguration is not just an end but a new beginning, both for Elijah and for the history of faith. This event transcends time and becomes a powerful symbol in both Jewish and Christian tradition. For Jews, Elijah is seen as a precursor, a messenger who will return before the coming of the Messiah. For Christians, Elijah's ascension serves as a reminder of the promise of eternal life and God's presence in moments of transition. Elijah's ascension challenges us to look beyond the physical, inviting us to reflect on what it means to be called to something greater. The Transfiguration also raises questions about what it means to live a life of faith. Elijah was not just a prophet but an example of someone who wholly devoted himself to God. His departure makes us think, how are we responding to the calling in our own lives? Are we ready to face difficulties and, if necessary, to be taken to new dimensions of our purpose? The story of Elijah continues to echo, reminding us of the importance of living with courage and conviction. Finally, Elijah's ascension invites us to consider the mysterious nature of God and his interventions in human life. Elijah did not experience death as we know it but was taken directly into the divine presence. This uniqueness leads us to reflect on the intimate relationship we can cultivate with God and how this can shape our destiny. Within each of us, there is potential for transformation, a calling to live extraordinarily, just as Elijah did. Elijah's legacy. Elijah's legacy extends far beyond his life and actions. He became a symbol of faith and resistance, inspiring not only his contemporaries but also future generations. His story resonates in many hearts, especially in times of crisis and uncertainty. Over the centuries, his figure has been invoked by those seeking strength amid adversity. What Elijah did and how he lived are lessons that continue to impact many lives. In Jewish tradition, Elijah is often mentioned in prayers and celebrations. He is seen as a defender of truth and an adversary of idolatry, characteristics that make him a model for those wishing to stand firm in their faith. During Passover, for example, an empty chair is left for Elijah, symbolizing the hope of his return and the promise of redemption. This ongoing expectation shows how deeply rooted his legacy is in the culture and spirituality of the people. For Christians, Elijah is a figure that prefigures Christ himself. His actions and mission serve as a parallel to the life of Jesus, who also faced opposition and preached the truth. The Transfiguration of Jesus, in which Elijah appears alongside Moses, further solidifies this connection. Therefore, Elijah's legacy is not just that of a solitary prophet, but a testimony that points to a greater truth, a hope that transcends time. Beyond his spiritual influence, Elijah's legacy also challenges us to consider how we are living our lives. He invites us to reflect on the importance of being voices of truth in a world often marked by lies and corruption. The courage he demonstrated in confronting authorities and false prophets is a call for all of us to do the same in our spheres of influence. Elijah's legacy is, therefore, an invitation to action, a summons for us to continue his fight for justice and truth. Lastly, Elijah's impact goes beyond biblical narratives. He has inspired works of art, literature, and even social movements. His life and struggle continue to be a source of inspiration for those seeking to live according to elevated principles and make a difference in the world. Elijah's legacy reminds us that, even in the face of the greatest challenges, we can leave an indelible mark on history if we are willing to rise up and be faithful to the calling we have received. Examples of faith. Elijah's faith is a central aspect of his story and a powerful example for contemporary believers. He not only heard God's calling, he also had the courage to act on that calling, even when circumstances were unfavorable. Elijah faced kings, prophets of Baal, and nature itself, always trusting in divine promise. His life is a testament that true faith is not free from challenges, but it is precisely in those moments of difficulty that it becomes most evident. The example of faith that Elijah leaves us is an invitation to trust in God, even when everything seems against us. In times of crisis, it is easy to doubt and feel helpless, but Elijah's story teaches us that faith should be an anchor amid the storm. He fervently prayed for it not to rain, and God responded. Later, he prayed again, and the rain returned. This persistence in prayer is a clear example of the power that faith can have in shaping the reality around us. Moreover, Elijah's faith was not limited to glorious moments. He also experienced moments of doubt and despair. His flight to the desert and his desire for death reveal that even the greatest prophets are human and vulnerable. However, even in his fragility, Elijah continued to seek God. This teaches us that faith does not need to be perfect, it can be a continuous process of seeking and surrender. It is the willingness to turn to God, even in difficult moments, that truly defines faith. Elijah also reminds us of the importance of community in the life of faith. Although he was a solitary prophet in many respects, his relationship with God and his interaction with other prophets and disciples show that faith is not an isolated journey. Connection with other believers can strengthen our own faith and encourage us to persevere. Elijah's story invites us to unite around a common purpose and support each other in our spiritual walk. Finally, Elijah's example of faith is a call to action. He did not settle for merely believing, he rose up and made a difference. This courage to face the impossible and the willingness to be an instrument in God's hands are characteristics we can all cultivate. Elijah's faith serves as a reminder that we are called to participate in the divine work, to be agents of transformation in a world that desperately needs light and hope. Confronting the impossible. Elijah's life is, in many ways, a masterclass on how to confront the impossible. From the moment he presented himself to King Ahab to his epic confrontation on Mount Carmel, Elijah demonstrated courage and determination that are truly inspiring. He did not hesitate to challenge the idolatry and corruption that dominated Israel, even when it meant putting his life at risk. This willingness is an example of how, when we trust in God, we can face even the most intimidating challenges. The confrontation on Mount Carmel is perhaps the most iconic episode in Elijah's life. He summoned the prophets of Baal for a public challenge, a contest that was not just about who could bring fire from heaven, but about the true nature of God. Elijah positioned himself against the odds, aware that his faith and relationship with God were more powerful than any human or spiritual force that could oppose him. This event not only solidified his position as a prophet but also reaffirmed God's sovereignty before the Israelite people. The central message that emerges from this confrontation is that true faith requires action. Elijah did not remain merely in prayer, he took concrete steps to demonstrate the existence of the true God. This action is a clear call for all of us. Faith should not be just a passive belief, but something that propels us to act, to speak, and to stand up amidst injustices. Confronting the impossible is part of every believer's calling, and Elijah's story encourages us not to back down in the face of difficulties. Moreover, Elijah's example teaches us that confronting the impossible often requires perseverance and patience. After the confrontation on Mount Carmel, Elijah faced Jezebel's wrath and found himself. And so, as we conclude this journey through Elijah's life, we are confronted with a powerful question: what would you do if you were in his place? Before kings, prophets, and even despair, Elijah not only faced the impossible but also showed us how faith can be a beacon amid darkness. Let us think together, in what areas of your life do you need the courage to rise up and make a difference? Elijah faced unimaginable challenges but always found strength in his connection with God. How can you strengthen your own faith and become a voice of hope in difficult times? Elijah teaches us that we are not alone in our battles. The struggle between good and evil is constant, and the voice that echoes from the past still resonates today. So, how about reflecting on this? What steps can you take to be an agent of change in your community? Don't forget to leave your comment and share your thoughts. Let's continue this conversation about faith, courage, and the importance of listening to the voice that calls us. Until next time, and remember, your story can also be a story of transformation.